What if I told you that before Islam reshaped the Middle East, there stood a Persian empire so powerful, so sophisticated, that even mighty Rome trembled before it? And what if I told you that this empire, though buried in time, shaped the very foundations of the world we live in today, from the way we govern to the way we wage war? This is the story of the Sassanian Empire, Persia's last pre-Islamic superpower. A civilization of glittering palaces, armored cataphracts, and divine kings who claimed to rule by the will of Ahura Mazda himself. From the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Armenia, from the gates of India to the walls of Constantinople, their influence burned bright until it suddenly vanished. But how did an empire that rivaled Rome fall so completely that history almost forgot its name? And what secrets lie buried beneath its ruins, whispering of emperors' betrayals and wars that changed the fate of civilizations forever? Stay with me, because over the next chapters, we're going to journey through the rise, the glory, and the tragic fall of the Sassanid Empire. A world of gods and kings, love and conquest, and one final stand before the dawn of Islam. The phoenix rises, Ardashir's revolt, and the birth of a new Persia. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to rebuild a fallen world from ashes? To look upon the ruins of greatness and whisper, "I will bring it back." The man who dared to do that was not born in a palace. He was not born with an army or a crown. He was born in the heart of forgotten Persia, when its glory was nothing but a memory whispered by fire priests and old storytellers. His name was Ardashir, and he would resurrect the Persian Empire after centuries of humiliation. But before his rise, Persia was a corpse that refused to decay. The Parthians, those horse-lord kings who had once humbled Rome, had grown fat on their own decadence. Their empire was a patchwork quilt of warring lords, corrupt governors, and rebellious provinces. Their kings in Ctesiphon ruled more through fear than faith, and the very heart of Persia, its ancient spirit of divine kingship, was gone. It was said that the sacred fire of Ahura Mazda no longer burned brightly in the temples. The Magi prayed out of duty, not devotion. Merchants spoke Greek in the cities, and the farmers of Persis, the old Achaemenid heartland, bowed to governors who didn't even speak their tongue. Persia had forgotten itself, but one night, in a small temple near the fortress of Gore, the sacred flame flickered higher than it had in years. A young nobleman stood before it, dressed in simple armor, his face lit by the golden glow. His eyes burned with something the priests hadn't seen in generations. Purpose. That night, Ardashir made a vow he would restore Persia to its ancient glory, not just by sword, but by fire and faith. By the will of Ahura Mazda. And to keep that vow, he would first have to destroy an empire. For decades, the Parthian kings had ruled through a delicate balance, offering autonomy to nobles so long as they pledged loyalty. But loyalty had long since turned to greed. Governors hoarded taxes, armies deserted. One by one, the outer provinces began to rot away. Armenia rebelled, Media defied orders. And in the south, in Persis, a man named Ardashir began to act as if he were already a king. At first, no one noticed. His father, Papak, was a local ruler loyal to the Parthians. But Papak died under mysterious circumstances. Some said illness. Others whispered poison, and Ardashir suddenly emerged as the lord of the region. Within months, he fortified his capital at Gore, renamed it Ardashir Quora, the glory of Ardashir, and began minting coins bearing his own image. It was the first open act of rebellion, a challenge written in silver. The Parthian court was stunned. "A provincial upstart dares to call himself king?" said Artabanus IV, the last Parthian monarch. "Let him learn what happens to those who defy the house of Arsaces." But what Artabanus didn't know was that his own nobles were already whispering doubts behind his back. The empire was sick, and Ardashir's rebellion spread like fever. Every city he conquered fed him more men, more resources, and most dangerously more belief. In the year 222 CE, he marched north. Imagine the scene, a vast desert plain under a burning sun, two armies facing one another. The Parthians with their proud banners, heavy cavalry glittering in chainmail, their cataphracts mounted on war horses bred from royal stables. Opposite them, Ardashir's smaller but disciplined force, their banners marked with fire symbols, their armor glinting dull and dark like the wings of ravens. Before the battle began, Ardashir rode to the front lines. His generals waited for orders, but he raised his hand for silence. He pointed east, toward the rising sun. "There lies the fire of Ahura Mazda," he said. "If the gods still favor Persia, the wind will turn from that direction." At that moment, a strong gust swept from the east, kicking up sand into the faces of the Parthian cavalry. Soldiers gasped, priests whispered prayers. Ardashir smiled, drew his sword, and charged. The battle that followed would be known as Hormuzgan, a turning point in history. For hours, the two sides clashed, but the Parthian formation began to collapse under Ardashir's tactical brilliance. He used a classic maneuver, the feigned retreat, drawing the Parthians into pursuit, then surrounding them with hidden wings of armored cavalry. The sandstorm that day blinded the Parthians, but for Ardashir's men, it was as if the fire god himself cleared their path. When the dust settled, King Artabanus lay dead on the field, pierced by Ardashir's own spear. 5 centuries of Parthian rule ended that day, not with a treaty, not with negotiation, but with a single strike. Ardashir dismounted, walked across the battlefield, and raised his hands toward the sky. "O Mazda, I have done as you willed. The house of Persia rises again." And somewhere beyond the desert horizon, perhaps in Rome itself, a chill ran down the spine of emperors. Word of Ardashir's victory spread like wildfire. In Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, the gates were opened to him without a fight. The nobles who had once sworn loyalty to Artabanus now knelt before the man they had mocked as a provincial warlord. Ardashir did not waste time on vengeance. Instead, he proclaimed the birth of a new dynasty, the Sassanian Empire, named after his ancestor Sassan, a revered high priest. He ordered a royal inscription carved deep into the cliffs of Nakshi-Rustem, near the tombs of the ancient Achaemenid kings. The carving shows Ardashir receiving the ring of kingship from Ahura Mazda himself, divine sanction, eternal legitimacy. Below them lies the fallen Artabanus, trampled beneath the hooves of Ardashir's horse. The message was unmistakable. The gods themselves had chosen Persia's rebirth. The new empire would not merely copy the past. Ardashir envisioned something greater, a revival not just of Persian rule, but of Persian spirit. He reorganized the state with ruthless precision. Governors became royal appointees, bound by oath to the crown. The army, once fragmented, became a professional force loyal only to the Shahanshah, the King of Kings. And at the heart of it all stood the sacred fire temples, restored to their ancient splendor. Zoroastrianism was reborn as the soul of the empire. It was more than politics. It was resurrection, but rebirth always comes with resistance. While Ardashir was busy rebuilding Persia, the Roman Empire watched uneasily from the west. To them, Parthia had been a known quantity, troublesome, but manageable. The Sassanids were something else entirely. Their rhetoric of divine kingship, their revived armies, their ambitions, it all smelled of danger. In 230 CE, only a few years after his coronation, Ardashir did something unthinkable. He invaded Roman-held Mesopotamia. His army swept across the Euphrates, taking Nisibis and Carrhae, cities that Rome considered their own. The Romans were stunned. Who dared invade them? The Emperor Severus Alexander marched east with a massive force, confident of victory. But Ardashir refused to meet him in open battle. Instead, he harassed the Romans' relentlessly scorched earth, ambush, night raids. The campaign dragged on for years, draining Roman morale. When Severus finally returned to Antioch, it was with fewer soldiers and even less pride. The message was clear. Persia was back, and it would no longer bow to anyone. And yet, behind this triumphant rise, a shadow was forming. Ardashir's eldest son, Shapur, was not like his father. He was quieter, more thoughtful, but just as ambitious. As the empire stabilized, Shapur began to question his father's methods. "A kingdom of fire and fear cannot endure," he once told a court priest. "If Persia is to last, it must also learn." These words reached Ardashir's ears. Some say he was furious. Others claim he smiled, recognizing the spark of destiny in his son's eyes. Whatever the truth, by the final years of his reign, Ardashir began grooming Shapur to inherit the throne not just as a king, but as a builder. One chronicler from later centuries wrote, Ardashir forged Persia in the furnace of war. Shapur would temper it with the hammer of wisdom. When Ardashir died around 242 CE, his body was laid to rest in a tomb of white marble, his crown placed upon his chest, his sword laid beside him. The flames of 1,000 temples burned that night across Persia, their light seen from the shores of the Gulf to the snows of Armenia. But his story didn't end in death, because when Shapur took the throne, the young empire would face its greatest test, yet against the mightiest foe the world had ever seen. As dawn broke over Ctesiphon, the city was silent. Shapur stood on the palace balcony, gazing at the golden reflection of the river below. Behind him, priests chanted prayers for his father's soul. Ahead lay the empire vast, young and trembling with potential. And beyond the horizon, across the Euphrates, the banners of Rome were already rising once more. The empire his father built in fire was about to be tested in blood. The new Shahanshah clenched his fist and whispered, "Let them come. Persia will answer." The age of Ardashir had ended. The age of Shapur had begun, but with it came a storm that would shake both East and West and decide, once and for all, who ruled the heart of the ancient world. The clash of titans, Shapur the Great and the war against Rome. Have you ever seen a son try to outshine the legend of his father? It's a dangerous inheritance, to be born in the shadow of a man who rebuilt an empire. When Ardashir the founder died, he left behind not only a throne but an expectation, a flame of divine destiny that his son could not afford to let fade. Shapur I inherited more than a crown. He inherited a mission, to prove that the Sassanian Empire was not a flicker of revival, but a roaring fire destined to challenge the might of Rome itself. But there was a problem. Rome was not just any enemy. It was the colossus of the world, the empire that had crushed Carthage, ruled Egypt, and claimed the Mediterranean as its private sea. To defeat Rome was not merely a victory. It was a declaration that Persia was the equal of the West, reborn as a divine counterweight to imperial arrogance. Shapur knew this. And deep down, he relished it. The year was 243 CE, the Roman Empire, sensing weakness in the newborn Persian state, sent its young emperor, Gordian III, to finish what his predecessor had failed to do, to crush the Sassanids once and for all. Gordian was barely 20, ambitious but untested. His army was enormous, filled with the best legions of the East, supported by elephants, siege engines, and auxiliaries from Syria and Arabia. To the Romans, this was to be an easy campaign, a triumphant march to Ctesiphon, but the desert remembers. And Persia does not forgive arrogance. As Gordian's legions advanced deep into Mesopotamia, they found themselves stretched thin. Supplies ran low. The sun scorched men in their armor. And then, without warning, the ambush began. Persian cavalry struck like lightning, hit, vanish, hit again. They moved through the dunes as if they were born of sand. Roman scouts went missing. Horses panicked at night. Shapur's troops, familiar with the terrain, circled them like predators around wounded prey. By the time Gordian reached the Euphrates, morale was collapsing. At Mizek near modern Fallujah, the two armies finally clashed. The fighting was brutal. The Romans fought valiantly, but the Persian strategy was cunning: lure them into marshland, then close the exits. The Romans were trapped. Panic spread. And in the chaos, Emperor Gordian was thrown from his horse. His neck snapped beneath his armor. The great Roman campaign ended not with conquest, but with a corpse lying in the mud. Shapur entered the field after the battle, riding a white stallion. He dismounted, stood over Gordian's lifeless body, and gazed in silence. Then he ordered a grand inscription carved into a cliff near Nakshi Rustam. It still stands today, a colossal relief showing Shapur on horseback, seizing the hand of a kneeling Roman emperor. The message was unmistakable. Persia was no longer Rome's shadow. It was her rival, but that was only the beginning. Rome could not allow such humiliation to stand. Within a few years, another emperor, Philip the Arab, marched east to avenge Gordian. Yet Shapur, always the strategist, offered peace instead of war, and here, a twist worthy of a legend unfolded. Shapur proposed that Rome pay tribute in exchange for peace, a shocking demand. To everyone's disbelief, Philip agreed. He paid a vast sum of gold and recognized Shapur's rule over Mesopotamia. For the first time in centuries, Rome had publicly bowed to Persia. In Ctesiphon, the news was celebrated as divine proof. The priests declared Shapur King of Kings of Iran and non-Iran, a title that thundered with cosmic ambition, but peace with Rome never lasts. Years passed. Shapur strengthened his empire, building roads, temples, and fortresses. He was not merely a conqueror. He was a builder. His capital, Gandeshapur, became a center of learning, blending Greek, Indian, and Persian thought, a beacon of early cosmopolitan science. He encouraged art and philosophy, but he also believed that knowledge was power. And he needed both. Because far away, a new Roman emperor was rising, a man who would become one of history's most stubborn warriors. His name was Valerian. Unlike Gordian or Philip, Valerian was no child, no opportunist. He was seasoned, disciplined, and utterly determined to restore Roman honor. In 259 CE, he assembled an army of unprecedented size, 70,000 men, and marched east. The old conflict between East and West was about to reach its climax. Picture the moment. Two worlds colliding. The Romans marched with banners of eagles and crimson shields. The Persians gathered beneath the wings of divine fire. Across the plains near Edessa, two empires stared each other down. The first day was a slaughter. The Romans, suffering from plague and dehydration, could barely maintain formation. Persian cavalry thundered through their flanks, arrows raining down like locusts. The legions fought desperately. Retreating into a camp surrounded by walls of wagons, Shapur ordered a siege. For days, the Persians circled them, cutting off food and water. Disease spread faster than courage. And then came the moment that would echo through centuries. Valerian, emperor of Rome, sent envoys begging for negotiations. Shapur agreed to meet. The Roman emperor rode out, tired, sick, desperate, to parley with the Persian king. He expected honorable treatment. Instead, Shapur's soldiers seized him, tore the imperial insignia from his armor, and dragged him before the Persian court as a prisoner. For the first and only time in Roman history, a sitting emperor was captured alive. The story of what happened next depends on who tells it. Roman sources, bitter and humiliated, say Shapur treated Valerian with cruelty, using him as a human footstool when mounting his horse, forcing him to serve as a symbol of Rome's submission. Persian chronicles tell a different story, that Valerian was treated with dignity, given a villa, and allowed to live in relative peace. But one thing is certain. Shapur immortalized the event in stone. At Nakshi Rustam, there is another relief: Shapur on horseback, gripping the wrist of a kneeling Valerian, with another emperor, Philip, bowing beside him. 3 Roman emperors, one dead, one humiliated, one captive, all beneath the gaze of Persia's king. It was not only art, it was propaganda carved in eternity. And the world took notice. In Rome, senators trembled. In Constantinople, whispers began that Persia was destined to rule the East. Even in India, coins were minted in Shapur's honor. For a brief, blinding moment, Persia stood at the summit of power. But empires burned brightest before the smoke. As Shapur basked in triumph, cracks began to appear beneath the surface. The war had drained the treasury. Provinces in the north rebelled. Nomads raided the borders. And inside the empire, new ideas were spreading, ideas that threatened the unity he had fought so hard to create. One of those ideas came from a prophet named Mani. Mani was a Persian mystic who claimed that all religions, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Buddhism, were fragments of a single divine truth. His followers called his teaching the religion of light. It spread quickly among merchants and scholars. But to the priests of Zoroaster it was heresy. At first, Shapur tolerated Mani, even debated philosophy with him. But as his empire grew restless, tolerance gave way to fear. An empire divided by faith, the Magi warned, will fall by faith. Shapur hesitated. He had conquered Rome itself, yet the thought of rebellion from within terrified him. He imprisoned Mani. Some say he was executed. Others say he vanished mysteriously. The flames of persecution began to rise, and with them, the first whispers of decline. Yet Shapur's legacy was far from over. Despite the turmoil, he continued to expand eastward, forging alliances with Indian kings, rebuilding cities, and erecting monuments that defied time. The empire under his reign stretched from the Euphrates to the Sassanian Empire of trade routes, silk caravans, and sacred fire temples, but perhaps his greatest legacy was something no sword could achieve. He planted in Persia the idea that power and faith were inseparable, that the king ruled not just by might, but by divine order. The crown and the flame became one. Rome could destroy armies, but not belief. When Shapur died around 270 CE, his body was buried near his father's tomb, surrounded by carvings of his victories. The priests chanted verses not of mourning, but of triumph. "He who captured the kings of the West," they said, "has joined the King of Light." The empire mourned, but far to the west, Rome was already stirring again. As centuries pass, the story of Shapur the Great often feels like myth. A Persian king who captured an emperor, who built cities that outlived his enemies, who ruled with both sword and scripture. But history is rarely content with heroes. After Shapur, the Sassanid throne became a battlefield of succession, and Rome, though wounded, was never truly defeated. A new generation of Roman emperors began to rise, hungering for revenge, the dream that Ardashir had lit, and Shapur had turned into a blazing inferno, now faced its first storms. In the shadows of Ctesiphon, among the marble columns and golden domes, the priests whispered of omens. Comets streaked the sky. The sacred fires flickered. Some said Ahura Mazda's favor was waning, and beyond the mountains, a new power was awakening, a faith that would one day sweep across Persia like a desert wind. But for now, the empire still burned bright, unaware that the next century would test it in ways even Shapur could not imagine, because the wars with Rome were only the beginning. The true battle for Persia's soul was yet to come. The eternal flame, king's faith, and the war for Persia's soul. Have you ever wondered how empires truly fall, not by the sword of an enemy, but by the shadows within their own soul? After Shapur the Great's thunderous reign, Persia stood taller than ever before. Its kings were gods on earth. Its priests declared its destiny eternal. The fire temples blazed from Mesopotamia to Bactria, and Rome itself had knelt in humiliation. Yet even as the empire glowed with glory, a quiet ember of decay was beginning to burn beneath its surface, because victory has a strange way of softening men. And peace can be far more dangerous than war. When Shapur died, he left behind an empire vast and proud, but also strained. His successors were trapped in a difficult inheritance, how to rule a realm born in battle but now desperate for stability. His son Hormizd the first reigned only briefly, a ruler more scholar than soldier, and his sudden death left the throne vulnerable. The next in line, Bahram I, was crowned amid whispers of dissent. Unlike his father and grandfather, Bahram lacked their charisma and command. He leaned heavily on the Zoroastrian clergy, the magi whose power had grown during Shapur's wars. The priests were no longer mere servants of the crown. They were partners in rule, and that alliance came with a price. The magi saw Persia not just as a political empire, but as a holy Roma kingdom chosen by Ahura Mazda to preserve truth against the forces of darkness. Their leader, the high priest Kartir, was a man of terrifying conviction. He believed the empire must be purified of heresy. Cleansed of foreign faiths, Kartir's inscriptions, carved into mountain cliffs, still declare his mission with chilling pride. I, Kartir, increased the religion of Mazda. I smote down heresy. Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, Christians, and Manichaeans, I struck them down. This was no metaphor. Under Bahram's reign, persecution swept across Persia. Temples were torn down. Foreign priests were exiled. The followers of many who had once preached harmony between faiths were hunted and burned. It was the empire's first great sin, and it came not from its enemies, but from its own zeal. The sacred flame of Ahura Mazda, once a symbol of unity and life, now cast long shadows of fear. But not all kings bowed to the Magi. Bahram II, who succeeded his father, was a different breed, a man of contradictions. Brave yet insecure, devout yet defiant. He tried to balance Cartier's religious fervor with the realities of ruling a diverse empire. Yet even as he prayed in temples, the empire was slipping from his grasp. In the distant east, rebellious governors rose against the crown. Nomads from Central Asia began raiding Persia's frontier. And in the west, the Roman Empire revived and reorganized sensed weakness. The year was 283 CE when the Roman Emperor Carus led a daring invasion. His legions stormed Mesopotamia, crossed the Tigris, and marched on Ctesiphon itself. The capital of Persia, the very city of kings, was taken, but then, as the Romans prepared to press further, fate, or perhaps the gods, intervened. A storm swept across the plains. Lightning struck Carus's tent, killing him instantly. The Romans, terrified by what they believed was divine wrath, retreated. The Persians saw it as a miracle. The fire of Mazda had saved them. Bahram II rode through the capital in triumph, hailed not as a survivor, but as a chosen one. Yet deep down, he knew the truth. The gods had not saved Persia. Luck had. And luck was running out. The next decades were years of turmoil and testing. The empire's borders quivered. Armenia, that eternal battlefield between Rome and Persia, became the heart of a new struggle, not just for land, but for faith, for centuries. Armenia had been the rope in the tug-of-war between the two empires. Its kings alternately loyal to Persia or Rome, but now something far more profound was stirring. A new faith, Christianity, was spreading through the mountain kingdoms. When King Tiridates III of Armenia converted, the effect was seismic. Rome, now Christian under Emperor Constantine, embraced the Armenian conversion as a divine victory. Persia, on the other hand, saw it as betrayal, a sacred land turning to the enemy's god. The Sassanid rulers could not allow that. It was Bahram II's successor, Narsa, who tried to reclaim Armenia through diplomacy. He was older, wiser, more patient than his predecessors. He rebuilt temples, reformed the bureaucracy, and even sought peace with Rome. But fate once again conspired against Persia. In 296 CE, the Roman Emperor Diocletian sent his brilliant general Galerius to crush Persian influence in Armenia. Narsa underestimated him. At first the Persians won, but Galerius regrouped and struck back fiercely. In one devastating night assault, Narsa's army was annihilated. His wives, his children, his entire royal camp captured, a king of kings humiliated. The Treaty of Nisibis that followed was brutal. Persia lost Armenia and much of Mesopotamia. The Romans gained trading rights, forts, and prestige. For the first time since Ardashir's rise, the Sassanian Empire knelt to the west. When Narsa returned to Ctesiphon, the once proud city fell silent. He did not order executions. He did not build monuments. He simply withdrew from public life and vanished into grief. It was said that the royal flames burned low during his final years, as if even the gods were in mourning. Yet history, like the phoenix, has a way of rebirthing itself after Narsa's death. His grandson Hormizd II inherited a broken empire, but one ready to heal. He opened roads, restored cities, and sought peace with the tribes of the east. But just as stability returned, tragedy struck again. During a hunting expedition, Hormizd was ambushed by conspirators within his own court nobles who feared his growing independence from the clergy. He was killed on the spot. The court erupted in chaos. His eldest son was blinded. Another son murdered, and then, in one of the strangest turns in Persian history, the crown was placed upon the unborn child of Hormizd's pregnant queen. The priests declared that the infant, yet to see the world, was still the rightful king. For months, the empire was ruled by regents and nobles in his name. That child, when he was finally born and old enough to rule, would change everything. His name was Shapur II. From the moment he could speak, Shapur was surrounded by symbols of loss. His father murdered. His empire humiliated. His throne defended by priests who had nearly destroyed the dynasty, but within that darkness, something extraordinary took shape. Shapur grew into one of the most formidable rulers Persia would ever know. Tall, fierce-eyed, and utterly relentless. He came to believe he was born for one purpose: to restore the Sassanian Empire to its divine glory. By the time he took full command, the Roman world had changed again. Constantine's heirs fought among themselves, and the Christianization of the empire was complete. To Shapur, this was not progress, it was provocation. The Christians inside Persia were now seen as agents of Rome, spies of the foreign god. So began one of the most tragic chapters in Persian history. The persecution of Christians under Shapur II was both political and spiritual. When Rome refused to pay tribute, Shapur retaliated by taxing Christian communities double. When bishops protested, they were imprisoned or executed. Thousands fled west. Those who stayed suffered for their faith, but the cruelty was not born of hatred alone. It was fear of losing Persia's soul to the faith of its enemy. Shapur's empire was vast, multicultural, and fragile. Religion was the glue that held it together, yet even as flames consumed the churches, Shapur's armies marched west once more. His campaigns against Rome lasted for decades. Long, grinding wars fought across the rivers and deserts of Mesopotamia. He retook cities lost generations ago. He even besieged Nisibis 3 times, each assault fiercer than the last. The defenders held, but barely. Roman chronicles describe him as the second Cyrus, a king who seemed to command not men, but destiny itself. And yet, despite his conquests, he could never fully break Rome. The two empires had become mirrors of each other, two suns locked in eternal orbit, each burning too bright to let the other live. By the time Shapur II grew old, Persia had been transformed once more. The clergy was powerful, the army unmatched. Trade flourished from the Mediterranean to India. Yet the empire's heart was weary. Too many wars, too many martyrs, too many graves. In the fire temples, the priests spoke of a prophecy that the world was entering the Third Age, when darkness and light would wage their final battle. Perhaps they were right, because far to the west, Rome was dying. Barbarians were gathering on its borders. And far to the south, in the deserts of Arabia, a new people were rising, unknown, poor, but destined to carry a revelation that would change Persia forever. But for now, as Shapur's coffin was laid beside his ancestors in Naqsh Rustam, the empire still shone with pride. The sacred fires blazed across the land. The Magi chanted that Persia's glory would last until the end of time. Yet in the stillness of night, as the flames flickered, even the priests must have wondered, how long can any fire burn before it consumes itself? Empire of Shadows, the fall of kings and the rise of the crescent. Have you ever seen a flame flicker before it dies not in weakness, but in one last, defiant burst of light? That was the Sassanian Empire in its final centuries. Strong on the outside, unbreakable in image, yet hollowing within. The fire still burned. Yes, but the oil that once fed it was running dry. When Shapur II's long reign finally ended in 379 CE, Persia stood as a superpower once again. The Roman frontiers trembled. The eastern provinces obeyed. The fire temples blazed with confidence. Yet beneath that surface of majesty, cracks had begun to form, cracks invisible to the priests but clear to history's eye. For centuries, the empire had lived by a single truth: that order came from the divine king and the sacred fire. But now, those who lit the fires, the priests and nobles, were fighting over who truly ruled Persia, and while they quarreled over faith and power, the world around them was changing. The first signs came from the west. Rome, Persia's eternal rival, was no longer the same foe. The empire had split into two halves, east and west. The Western Roman Empire staggered toward collapse under barbarian invasions, while the Eastern, now called Byzantine, looked eastward with suspicion. Emperor Julian, known to history as the Apostate, sought to reclaim lost glory by marching against Persia in 363 CE. He led a massive army deep into Mesopotamia, confident he could outmatch the Sassanids. But Shapur II had left a legacy of fortresses and scorched earth tactics. Julian's legions burned villages but found no supplies, no rest. One night near Ctesiphon, the Persians struck with surgical precision. Arrows rang from the darkness. Chaos swept the Roman camp. Emperor Julian was impaled by a spear no one knows whose hand threw it. Some say Persian, others say his own men. He died before dawn, whispering bitterly, "Thou hast conquered, Galilean." His death was seen by the Persians as divine vengeance. Rome retreated again, humiliated, and Persia rejoiced. Yet even in victory, the empire's heart was weary, for no triumph lasts forever. The next century was an age of exhaustion. Kings rose and fell in rapid succession, each inheriting a realm more divided than before. Nobles controlled the provinces like personal kingdoms. The Magi ruled the conscience of the state. While peasants burdened by taxes and war began to turn away from faith itself, there were moments of brilliance still. King Yazdegerd I, who ruled from 399 to 420 CE, tried to heal the empire through tolerance. He protected Christians and Jews, defied the Magi, and sought peace with Byzantium. The priests called him Yazdegerd the Sinner, but the people called him Yazdegerd the Merciful. For a time, it seemed the empire might find balance again. But peace is fragile in the hands of kings. When Yazdegerd died, some say poisoned by the clergy, chaos returned with a vengeance. His sons and nobles turned on one another. Blood once again stained the royal halls of Ctesiphon. Out of that chaos rose a figure destined to reign. Like a storm, Bahram V. Remembered in legend as Bahram Gur the Hunter King, Bahram Gur's reign was a paradox of beauty and brutality. A lover of music, poetry, and hunting, he filled his court with storytellers and philosophers. The poets of Persia would later romanticize him as a noble hero, a king who tamed lions and fell in love with princesses from distant lands, but behind the legend lay a ruler constantly fighting for survival. His throne was won only after a desperate struggle with the nobles and clergy who sought to control him. He relied on Arab tribes from the desert to secure his power, unknowingly strengthening forces that would one day decide Persia's fate. Yet, Bahram's charm and cunning gave the empire one last cultural flourish. Under his patronage, Persian art, music, and literature blossomed. The royal city of Ctesiphon glittered with mosaics and gardens. The Book of Kings Shahnameh would later immortalize this era as one of glory, romance, and light, but outside those golden walls, storms gathered. The empire's frontiers were cracking. To the east, nomadic Huns known as the Hephthalites poured into Persia's borders, burning cities and enslaving thousands. The once mighty cavalry of Persia, its proud cataphracts clad in armor and faith, struggled against these unpredictable horsemen. By the time Bahram's successors took the throne, the empire was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The nobles quarreled over the crown, the priests quarreled over dogma, and the peasants, crushed by taxation, began to whisper of rebellion. One of those whispers would change everything. In 484 CE, King Paros I led his army east to confront the Hephthalites. He marched confidently, believing his ancestors' fire would protect him. But it was a trap. The Hephthalites dug hidden trenches along the battlefield. When the Persian cavalry charged, they plunged into pits. Horses, armor, and men swallowed whole. The king himself was killed. His crown was taken as a trophy. The empire's eastern border was shattered. For years after, Persia lived under the shadow of foreign tribute, forced to pay gold to the very barbarians it once scorned. The fire temples still burned, but their light no longer reached the edges of the empire. Then, as if the gods took pity, a miracle appeared in human form. Khosrow I, known as Anushirvan, the immortal soul. Crowned in 531 CE, Khosrow inherited a kingdom on the edge of ruin and transformed it into one of the greatest states the ancient world had ever seen. He reformed everything: the army, the taxes, the administration. He crushed corrupt nobles and executed greedy priests. He built roads, hospitals, and schools. Under his rule, Persia became not just a military power, but a civilization of philosophy and science. At his court in Ctesiphon, scholars from Greece, India, and China gathered to translate and debate. It was said that under Khosrow, wisdom spoke Persian. Even his enemies admired him. The Byzantine historian Procopius called him Khosrow the Just. But justice has its cost. His wars against Byzantium drained the treasury. His strict laws alienated nobles. And when he died, the balance he had built began to crumble once more. His son, Hormizd IV, lacked his father's grace. Proud and paranoid, he quarreled with the generals who had made Persia strong. One of those generals, Bahram Shaban, a war hero beloved by the army, finally rebelled. In 590 CE, he marched on Ctesiphon and seized the throne. Hormizd was executed. His son, a young prince named Khosrow, fled into exile into Byzantine territory. And here, history twisted upon itself. The Persian prince begged help from his empire's oldest enemy, the Byzantines. Emperor Maurice agreed, seeing an opportunity to control Persia from within. With Byzantine troops, Khosrow returned, defeated Bahram, and reclaimed his throne as Khosrow II Parvaz, the victorious. For a moment, it seemed Persia had been reborn again, but destiny was playing its final game. Khosrow II's reign, 590 to 628 CE, was dazzling, a time of gold and conquest. He married a Christian queen, Shirin, whose beauty would become legend. He built palaces so vast that their ruins still echo with whispers of grandeur. His armies, led by brilliant generals, swept westward, taking Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and even the city of Jerusalem itself. The world stood in awe. The Persians carried away the true cross from Jerusalem, the holiest relic of Christendom. The Byzantines seemed finished. For the first time in history, the Persian Empire stretched to the Mediterranean Sea. And yet, it was too much. Empires often break not when they lose, but when they win too much. Too fast. The constant wars drained Persia's wealth. Famine spread. Nobles plotted. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, desperate and brilliant, struck back with fury. Between 622 and 627 CE, he launched a lightning campaign through the Caucasus, cutting Persia's supply lines, burning temples, and rallying Christian provinces. At the Battle of Nineveh in 627 CE, the Persians were crushed. Khosrow fled Ctesiphon. His own generals turned against him. In 628, he was dragged from his chambers and executed by his son, Khosrow I. It was the end of an age, the death of the last great Persian emperor. In the chaos that followed, the empire disintegrated. Kings rose and fell in months. Civil war raged. The treasury was empty. The sacred fires dimmed. And across the southern deserts, unseen and underestimated, a new power was stirring, one unlike anything the world had known before. Arab tribes, once dismissed as mere raiders, were now united under a single faith. They called it Islam, and their message was simple but unstoppable. There is no God but God. Within a decade, their armies would emerge from Arabia like a sandstorm, carrying both the sword and the word. The exhausted Sassanian Empire would face them at Qadisiyah, Nahavand, and the plains of Persia itself. But that is the final act of our story, because when the fire of the old world met the crescent of the new, the earth itself seemed to tremble. The last flame, fall of an empire, birth of a world. Have you ever watched the final glow of a sunset linger on the horizon, so beautiful, so radiant that for a moment you forget it means the coming of night? That was Persia in the 7th century. The Sassanid Empire, centuries old, glittered still with the jewels of its glorious past. The palaces of Ctesiphon gleamed beneath gilded domes. The sacred fires still blazed in their temples. And nobles still toasted to kings who called themselves Shahanshah, King of Kings. But beneath the gold and fire, the empire was already dying. The wars of Khosrow II had left the land scarred. The royal treasury was empty. The fields lay unharvested, the soldiers unpaid. Floods and famine struck in the same years. The nobles schemed. The magi bickered. The crown itself became a prize to be passed between rivals, not a symbol of divine rule. In the years following Khosrow's death, no fewer than 12 kings ruled Persia in less than 2 decades. Some were assassinated, others overthrown, a few ruled for mere months before vanishing from history. The empire of Ardashir and Shapur, once so proud, so invincible, was tearing itself apart, and that was when the desert wind began to blow far to the south. In the sands of Arabia, a new faith had taken root. It began not in a palace, but in a cave near Mecca, where a man named Muhammad, peace be upon him, claimed revelation from God. His message was unlike anything the old empires had known. It spoke of one God, justice, equality, and destiny beyond the grasp of kings. At first, the great powers Rome and Persia barely noticed. Arabia was a wilderness, its tribes fragmented. But within a single generation, the impossible happened. The tribes united not under a chieftain, but under belief. By the time the prophet passed away in 632 CE, his followers controlled nearly all of Arabia. Under his successors, the caliphs, their gaze turned outward. To the north lay two empires, Byzantium, still recovering from its near-death struggle with Persia, and the Sassanian Empire, magnificent but mortally wounded. The Muslims did not come as conquerors of wealth, but as bearers of conviction. To them, Persia was not a rival, it was the next chapter of divine destiny. And so, the storm began. The first great clash came at the Battle of Qadisiyah in 636 CE. Near the Euphrates River, on one side stood the might of ancient Persia war elephants, armored cataphracts, banners embroidered with the symbols of the sun and fire. On the other, an army of desert-born warriors outnumbered, lightly armed, but burning with faith. The Persian commander, Rostam Farrokhzad, was a veteran of 100 battles, a man who had served under kings and seen empires rise and fall. The Arabs respected him. This man, one Muslim chronicler wrote, was brave enough to stare at death as if it were an old friend. For 3 days the battle raged. Arrows darkened the sky. The elephants trampled men and horses alike. The Arabs nearly broke until a sandstorm swept across the battlefield. The wind turned in their favor, blinding the Persians just as it had once blinded their enemies under Ardashir. Rostam was struck down amid the chaos, his body lost in the dust. The Persian army crumbled. The fire banners fell when the storm cleared. The battlefield was silent except for the whisper of the wind and the chant of the victors. Allahu Akbar, the impossible had happened. The armies of Arabia had defeated the heirs of Cyrus and Darius, but Persia was not finished yet. The court fled east to Media, where a new king, Yazdegerd III, the last of the Sassanid line, was crowned. He was only 16, earnest and frightened. Yet the Magi told him he was chosen by the gods to restore the empire. He gathered what remained of the Persian army. Messengers rode across mountains and deserts, calling on governors and nobles to rise in the name of Iran. Some answered. Many did not. Still, Yazdegerd tried. He rallied his troops at Nahavand in 642 CE. The battle, Persians would later call the victory of victories, the outcome, however, was not theirs. The Muslims struck swiftly, surrounding the Persian forces, luring them into narrow valleys. The once proud cavalry was trapped, their elephants useless in tight terrain. The Persian lines broke. Thousands fell. The last true army of the empire was gone. Yazdegerd escaped once again, fleeing deeper east each time, first to Ray, then to Merv, chased not by armies alone, but by history itself. For nearly a decade, the young king wandered his own empire like a ghost of a vanished world. He sought allies among the Turks, the Chinese, the governors of distant provinces. They offered him words, but no armies. The empire that had once ruled from the Indus to the Mediterranean was now reduced to rumor and memory. The fire temples still burned in some corners, but fewer priests came to tend them. Cities fell not to siege, but to silence. In 651 CE, in a small town near Merv, the last act was written. Yazdegerd, abandoned by his court, found refuge in a miller's hut. The man, seeing the royal garments and jewels, murdered him in his sleep for the gold. When the villagers discovered the truth, they buried the boy king in secret, and so ended 400 years of Sassanid rule. Not with an army, not with a coronation, but with a whisper in the dark. The empire that had once rivaled Rome was gone. The sacred fires dimmed. The last king of kings had fallen, yet this is not a tale of mere endings. Because from that fall, something extraordinary was born. The Muslims who conquered Persia did not destroy its soul, they absorbed it. Persian administrators, philosophers, and artists entered the service of the caliphate. They carried with them centuries of knowledge: astronomy, medicine, architecture, poetry, and infused the young Islamic world with the brilliance of their ancestors. Within a century, the Abbasid Caliphate would rise in Baghdad, a city whose language, art, and science were deeply Persian at heart. Persian culture did not die, it transformed. It became the foundation of a new world civilization. The Zoroastrian flame may have dimmed, but its spirit of light and wisdom lived on in Islamic philosophy, in Persian poetry. In the shimmering palaces of Samarkand and Isfahan, Ardashir's dream of a Persian world never truly ended. It simply changed form. Even the ruins of Ctesiphon refused to vanish. Travelers from later centuries wrote of its great arch, the Khosrow, still standing tall, a silent monument to a civilization that once ruled half the world. The arch became a symbol, not of defeat, but of endurance, for every empire that falls leaves behind something eternal, the memory of what it dared to be. And so, when we speak of the Sassanid Empire, we are not speaking of ashes. We are speaking of a civilization that shaped law, art, and the very idea of kingship for 1,000 years after its fall. Its stories lived on through poets like Ferdowsi, whose Shahnameh would one day resurrect the heroes of ancient Persia, preserving them not for kings, but for the hearts of ordinary people. In those verses, the Sassanids lived again, not as tyrants or conquerors, but as dreamers, warriors, and guardians of a world that refused to be forgotten. As centuries passed, Persia rose anew under different banners: the Safavids, the Timurids, the Khayars, but each in its own way carried the echo of that ancient empire. The fire temples were replaced by mosques, yet the geometry of the domes, the art on the walls, the poetry and the calligraphy all whispered of Sassanid hands. Even today, when you walk through modern Iran, the past still breathes beneath the surface: the symbols of the winged crown, the ruins of Persepolis, the echoes of kings who claimed the light of Ahura Mazda. Empires end, civilizations do not. The Sassanids taught the world that power can be broken, but culture is eternal. That belief is not erased by conquest. It evolves, survives, and reemerges in ways the conquerors can never predict. And so, the last flame of Persia did not die. It passed its light into another torch, the torch of civilization itself, if you listen closely. In the wind that sweeps across the ruins of Ctesiphon, you can almost hear the distant echo of hooves, the crackle of sacred fire, the whisper of an oath sworn long ago by the light of Mazda: Persia shall never be forgotten. And that prophecy came true. The empire fell, yes, but the idea of Persia endured. Through faith, through poetry, through time itself, because some empires are not built to last forever. They are built to teach the world how to remember. Legacy of fire: how the Sassanid spirit shaped the world. Have you ever wondered what happens to a civilization when its empire dies, but its soul refuses to fade? The Sassanids were gone, their kings buried beneath the sands of time, their palaces shattered, their armies scattered. Yet somehow their spirit lived on. It slipped quietly through history's cracks, reappearing in new faces, new faiths, new worlds. The fire they carried, the fire of wisdom, order, and light, did not go out. It changed shape. It became part of humanity's story. When the Sassanid Empire fell to the Arab conquests in the mid-7th century, most would have expected Persia to vanish, absorbed by the rising tide of Islam. But what happened next was one of history's most extraordinary transformations. Instead of being erased, Persia helped transform the very world that conquered it. In the great cities of the new Islamic world, Basra, Kufa, Baghdad, Persian scholars became the architects of empire. They were scribes, administrators, mathematicians, physicians. They took the complex bureaucracy of the Sassanids and refined it, shaping the foundations of what we now call Islamic civilization. The caliphs may have ruled in Arabic, but the language of intellect, the whisper of science, philosophy, and poetry was Persian. When the Abbasid dynasty rose in the 8th century, its rulers built Baghdad as a city of both power and knowledge. The great house of wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, became the beating heart of the medieval world, a place where Greek, Indian, and Persian ideas were translated and synthesized. and at its core stood Persian minds, physicians like Al-Razi, Rhazes, philosophers like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi. The father of algebra, these men were the true heirs of the Sassanids, not through blood but through brilliance. They carried forward the tradition of curiosity, of logic, of sacred learning that had once filled the libraries of Ctesiphon. The empire had fallen. The civilization had not, but Persia's influence was not only intellectual, it was deeply spiritual. Zoas Tarayan Ism. The old faith of the Sassanid kings had taught that the world was a battleground between light and darkness, truth and falsehood, order and chaos. Those ideas, so ancient, so poetic, echoed quietly through the philosophies of Islam, Christianity, and even medieval mysticism, the concept of a cosmic struggle, of divine justice, of heaven and hell, of the soul's journey toward purity. These were not erased with the fall of the Sassanids. They lived on, subtly shaping how later civilizations understood morality and God. Even Islamic eschatology, the Day of Judgment, the resurrection of souls, bears traces of Zoroastrian influence. In a sense, the fire temples never truly went out. Their light simply merged with a new dawn, and that synthesis of Persian wisdom and Islamic faith would give birth to one of history's greatest cultural renaissances under dynasties like the Sassanids, Buyids, and later the Safavids. Persian language and art rose from the ashes. Court poets began writing not in Arabic, but in Persian. Once again a rebirth that would define the literary soul of Iran for centuries. The greatest of these poets was Ferdowsi, who lived 1,000 years after Ardashir. In his epic masterpiece Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, he resurrected the entire lost history of Persia. From the creation of the world to the fall of the Sassanians. It took him 30 years to write, and when it was complete, he had done something no empire ever could. He had made Persia immortal through his verses. The deeds of Ardashir, Shapur, Khosrow, and even the tragic Yazdegerd III were reborn not as forgotten monarchs, but as timeless symbols of courage, justice, and destiny. The Shahnameh became the bridge between pre-Islamic and Islamic Persia, binding two worlds that history had tried to tear apart. Even the caliphs, who once saw Zoroastrianism as a relic, would recite Ferdowsi's poetry, for within those lines burned something universal, the eternal flame of identity. Art and architecture, too, carried the Sassanid imprint into the Islamic era. The domes of Persian mosques, the symmetry of gardens, the intricate arabesques carved into stone, all owed their lineage to Sassanid design. The great arch of Ctesiphon, Khosrow, inspired the architects of Samarra, Isfahan, and even Istanbul. The vaulting systems, the geometric perfection, the vision of a divine harmony expressed through structure, all of it was born in the palaces of the old Persian kings. Even the concept of the royal court in the Islamic world, the grandeur, the ceremonial robes, the jeweled thrones, came directly from the Sassanid idea of divine kingship. The Abbasids adopted the Persian system of viziers, courtiers, and scribes, transforming Arab rule into something far more sophisticated, more imperial. So even in death, the Sassanids ruled, not through armies but through ideas. But perhaps the most profound legacy of all lies not in stone or scripture, but in the Persian soul itself, the resilience that allowed a conquered people to outlast their conquerors. When the Arabs came, they brought a faith that would change Persia forever. But it was Persia that changed the way that faith was understood. The Persian vision of Islam, philosophical, poetic, mystical, gave rise to the great Sufi tradition where devotion became art and love became theology. Think of Rumi, Hafez, Saadi, poets who spoke not of empire but of eternity. Their words, born in Persia, would travel the world, crossing borders, crossing centuries, teaching humanity that the divine could be found in beauty, in longing, in the human heart itself. This was the final transformation of the Sassanid spirit, from the rule of kings to the reign of ideas. And so, when we look back across the ruins of time, across the long arc from Ardashir's first rebellion to the poets of Shiraz, we see something more than history. We see a pattern, the rise, the glory, the fall, and the rebirth of an idea too powerful to die. The Sassanid Empire may have been Persia's last pre-Islamic superpower, but it was also its first modern one, a civilization that understood administration, faith, culture, and identity not as separate realms but as a single, divine harmony. In that harmony lay its true greatness. The Romans conquered with law, the Chinese with order, but the Persians conquered with spirit, with a vision of the world as a moral battleground, where light and truth forever struggle against darkness and deceit, and that vision continues to live, not just in Iran, but wherever people strive for justice, beauty, and wisdom in a world that so often forgets its own light. Today, if you visit the ruins of Persepolis or the Arch of Ctesiphon, you can still feel it, the echo of a heartbeat long gone yet somehow alive. The wind moves through the stones like a whisper of kings. The sunlight strikes the carvings, and for a brief moment, the faces of Ardashir and Shapur seem to breathe again. They remind us that civilizations are like stars. They burn, they fade, but their light travels forever, and somewhere in that light, the Sassanid Empire still shines, its fire reflected in the poetry of Rumi, in the tiles of Isfahan, in the quiet dignity of a people who never stopped believing that truth, no matter how long it sleeps, will always rise again. Because in the end, that was Persia's greatest gift to the world, the belief that darkness is never final, that even when empires fall, the flame of wisdom endures. And that somewhere, in the ashes of every ending, waits the beginning of something eternal.